The story of Stalin's Gulags is one of the darkest chapters in human history. A network of forced labor camps scattered across the vast, frozen expanse of the Soviet Union. These were not simply prisons for the guilty, they became instruments of terror designed to break human spirit, erase dissent, and silence millions who had the misfortune of falling under suspicion. Life inside the Gulags was already a slow execution by hunger, disease, and exhaustion. But for many, death came not through neglect, but through deliberate brutality. Executions carried out with a cruelty that is hard to stomach even today. The Gulags were born in the late 1920s as Stalin consolidated power. Officially, they were framed as corrective labor camps, where political enemies, criminals, and ordinary citizens could redeem themselves through work. In reality, they became prisons without walls. Vast tracts of land surrounded not by steel fences, but by endless wilderness. Escape was nearly impossible. The camps spread from Siberia's icy wastelands to the swamps of Karelia and the deserts of Kazakhstan. At their peak, they held millions of prisoners, each a victim of a system that treated human beings as disposable tools for the state. Inside, every prisoner faced starvation rations, grueling labor, and the constant threat of violence from guards. But executions were the final and most chilling weapon of control. Some were public, staged to terrify others into obedience. Others were secret, carried out in the dead of night. Their victims vanished without record. For many, the mere possibility of execution created a climate of fear that kept prisoners in line when hunger and exhaustion could not. The methods themselves were shockingly varied, shaped by the brutality of the era and the indifference of those in power. The most common was the bullet. Prisoners lined up, often blindfolded, and shot in the back of the head. This method of economy, as NKVD officers coldly called it, was efficient, quick, and silent enough to dispose of thousands. During the Great Purges of the late 1930s, entire groups of prisoners were marched into forests near camps, forced to kneel before pits already dug, and executed one by one, their bodies covered hastily with earth. Mass graves unearthed decades later testify to the scale of this violence. But not all executions were so swift. In some gulags, prisoners were executed by starvation, deliberately denied rations until they collapsed. This was less visible, less official, but equally lethal. Others were beaten to death in disciplinary punishments, where guards unleashed violence under the guise of maintaining order. These beatings often ended in broken skulls and shattered bodies left to rot in the snow. In some cases, prisoners were tied to posts and left exposed to Siberia's brutal winters. Death by freezing, a slow and agonizing ordeal. Equally horrifying were the psychological executions. Prisoners often spoke of the knock on the door at night, when NKVD guards would summon names from the barracks. Those taken rarely returned. Fellow inmates learned to listen in silence, their fear as lethal as the bullet that awaited their comrades. Families outside the Gulags rarely received word of what happened. Official records often listed vague causes of death, illness, accident, natural causes, when in reality it was execution that claimed the lives. The executions were not just acts of punishment, they were tools of political theater. Stalin's regime relied on fear to maintain its iron grip, and the Gulags became stages where that fear was played out. Prisoners accused of plotting escapes or organizing protests were executed publicly before their comrades, their deaths a warning. Others were accused of espionage or sabotage without evidence, their executions a signal to the outside world that Stalin's enemies were being crushed. In this way, the Gulags served not only as prisons but as propaganda, proof that loyalty was mandatory and disobedience fatal. Survivor accounts paint a grim picture of what it meant to live under the shadow of such executions. One former prisoner described how men would whisper prayers in the barracks at night, knowing that morning might never come. Another recalled the silence of the forest surrounding the camps, where she and others knew thousands of bodies lay buried in unmarked pits. The knowledge that death could come at any moment stripped life of meaning, leaving only survival from one day to the next. For the guards, the executions became routine, an administrative task no different from counting rations or organizing work brigades. Some were hardened ideologues, convinced they were defending the revolution. Others were ordinary men corrupted by power, using the camps as arenas for cruelty. Whatever their motives, they became agents of a system that turned killing into a daily function of governance. The brutality of the Gulag executions cannot be separated from the broader terror of Stalin's rule. They were part of a culture where human life was expendable, where ideology justified atrocity, and where fear became the glue that held a crumbling empire together. The bunkers of granite and steel that Stalin built across the Soviet Union were symbols of power, but the gulags were his true fortress, the places where fear was manufactured, one execution at a time. Yet the horror of these executions lies not only in their violence but in their silence. For decades, the Soviet regime suppressed the truth, burying records and silencing survivors. Families were left in the dark, never knowing how or when their loved ones died. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union did mass graves begin to tell the story the state had long tried to erase. The truth is that the executions of Stalin's gulags were not random acts of cruelty, but deliberate instruments of terror, meant to break bodies, minds, and spirits. They remind us of how power can corrupt to the point where death becomes policy and human suffering becomes a tool of governance. And they challenge us to remember, because forgetting would mean repeating the same horrors under different names and in different times. To understand the brutality of executions inside Stalin's gulags, one must place them within the wider machinery of terror that defined the great purges of the 1930s. Stalin's Soviet Union was a state built not just on ideology but on fear. The gulags were only one arm of a massive system of control, and executions were its sharpest blade. During the height of the purges between 1936 and 1938, death inside these camps was not the result of accident or mismanagement. It was policy dictated from the very top. The purges began as Stalin sought to consolidate absolute power. He feared rivals within the Communist Party, suspected conspiracies in the military, and distrusted intellectuals, minorities, and anyone with foreign connections. Through the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, Stalin orchestrated mass arrests on fabricated charges. Once accused of counter-revolutionary activity, or sabotage, few escaped. Show trials in Moscow provided a theatrical front, but for the millions swept up in the dragnet, there were no trials, no lawyers, no appeals. They were shipped to gulags by train, packed into cattle cars, their fates sealed before they even arrived. Within the camps, executions became a way to manage both real and imagined threats. Prisoners accused of organizing revolts or escape attempts were swiftly eliminated. Informants inside the barracks fed names to guards, who in turn dragged men and women before makeshift tribunals. These were no courts, just rubber stamp sessions where guilt was predetermined. Sentences were carried out the same night, often with a single gunshot behind camp walls or deep in nearby forests. Entire barracks sometimes woke to the sound of distant gunfire, knowing comrades would never return. The scale of the killings is difficult to comprehend. Historians estimate that during the purges alone, hundreds of thousands of Gulag prisoners were executed. In certain camps, mass killings became routine. Forests near Kolyma Vorkuta and Karelia still conceal pits where thousands were dumped, layer upon layer, their names never recorded. Excavations in the 1990s uncovered bones piled together in grotesque heaps, bullets still lodged in skulls. Grim confirmation of testimonies survivors had given decades earlier. Execution served Stalin's paranoid logic. By eliminating supposed traitors within the gulags, he ensured that even among the imprisoned, loyalty was demanded. The gulags were meant to be places of punishment, but executions made them places of annihilation. Death was not just a possibility, it was always present, an unspoken shadow that hung over every prisoner's life. The methods varied, but efficiency was always prized. The NKVD preferred bullets, cheap, quick, and final. Victims were often blindfolded, ordered to kneel, and shot once in the back of the head. Sometimes prisoners were told they were being transferred or released, only to be led into the woods and executed without warning. Others were taken in groups, lined up before open pits, and mowed down by machine guns. The soil of Siberia, soaked in blood, became the silent witness of a state's violence against its own people. But executions were not always so direct. Some prisoners were condemned to slow deaths, through deliberate starvation or exposure. Guards withheld food rations, forcing men and women to collapse from weakness. Others were stripped of clothing and tied to posts outside in the freezing winter. An execution method so cruel that survivors described hearing the screams of victims carried by the wind until their voices froze into silence. Beatings by guards, while officially punishment, often ended fatally, turning disciplinary violence into execution by another name. What makes this horror worse is the calculated secrecy. Families of executed prisoners were rarely informed. Official records listed vague causes of death: pneumonia, heart failure, accident. The Soviet bureaucracy excelled at burying truth beneath paperwork, ensuring that loved ones never knew their real fate. In some cases, families did not learn the truth until decades later, when declassified archives revealed the dates and methods of execution. Even then, the details were sparse, stripped of humanity by cold, bureaucratic language. Executions also reinforced Stalin's control over the guards themselves. NKVD officers were both executioners and potential victims. Failing to carry out quotas or showing mercy could result in their own arrest. This system of fear turned men into killers, forcing them to execute strangers one night while fearing the same fate the next. The purges consumed not only the innocent but also the enforcers, binding everyone in a cycle of terror. Survivors who witnessed executions described them as the breaking point of human dignity. Some recalled the silence of entire barracks after a night of shootings, men and women staring into darkness, unable to speak. Others remembered the faces of friends marched away, trying to offer one last glance of hope before disappearing forever. The executions stripped the camps of humanity, replacing it with a constant, suffocating awareness of death. For Stalin, this was victory. Executions inside gulags were not only about killing bodies, they were about destroying morale. They created an atmosphere of hopelessness so complete that resistance became unthinkable. The gulags turned into factories of obedience, where fear of the bullet replaced the will to survive. The Great Purges ended in 1938 with the fall of NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhov, but the executions did not. They continued, less visibly, through the 1940s and 1950s, woven into the Gulag system itself. Even after Stalin's death in 1953, the graves of his victims remained hidden, the silence of their suffering unbroken. The executions in Stalin's gulags reveal the terrifying efficiency of state terror. They were not random acts of violence, but part of a machine that consumed millions. And they remind us of how fragile human life becomes when power is unchecked and fear is used as a weapon. The bullet to the back of the head, the mass grave in the forest, the silence of families left behind. These were not accidents of history. They were deliberate, systematic choices made in service of a regime that valued control above all else. The executions that took place within Stalin's gulags during the Great Terror and beyond cannot be described only by numbers or lists. What made them so brutal was not just the final act of killing, but the methods, the rituals, and the cruelty that surrounded them. These were not sterile military operations. They were spectacles of control carried out in ways that broke not just the bodies of prisoners but their very sense of humanity. Beyond the bullet, beyond the paperwork of the NKVD, The executions in the gulags became instruments of psychological torment and physical annihilation. In many camps, the most common execution was indeed the bullet to the back of the head, carried out quickly in cellars or forest clearings. But the gulags also provided countless examples of more drawn-out and brutal forms of killing. Some prisoners were beaten to death by guards under the guise of discipline. Accounts from survivors describe how a man could be dragged out of a barrack for an alleged infraction, a missing tool, a whispered complaint, and returned only as a corpse, his body shattered by truncheons, boots, and rifle butts. For the rest of the prisoners, watching someone beaten to death was a reminder that survival depended on absolute submission, even to absurdity. Others were executed by exposure, a method both primitive and terrifyingly effective in Siberia's frozen wastelands. Guards would strip prisoners of their coats and boots and force them outside into the snow, binding them to posts or leaving them in open fields. The cold did the rest, slowly freezing them alive as other inmates listened to the groans and pleas fading into silence. To the NKVD, this was cost-effective. No bullets wasted, no official record. To the survivors, it was torture disguised as execution, a death that turned nature itself into an accomplice. Starvation was another common execution. By neglect, used especially against political prisoners or those deemed too dangerous to keep alive but too useful to kill openly. Instead of a gunshot, their rations were cut to nothing. Within weeks, their bodies wasted away. Other prisoners watched as they withered, their eyes hollow, their bones protruding through thin skin. Starvation executions were particularly cruel because they were disguised as routine punishment. The guards could pretend nothing was happening, while the victim endured a slow, conscious descent into death. There were also executions staged as theater. When prisoners were accused of plotting an escape or conspiring against guards, they were often executed in front of their fellow inmates. Survivors describe being assembled in freezing courtyards to witness men shot publicly. The condemned were forced to dig their own graves, sometimes with bare hands in frozen ground, before being shot and buried on the spot. These displays were designed to leave no illusions, any resistance. Any whisper of rebellion would end in the same way. Guards encouraged prisoners to watch, to absorb the fear, and to carry it back into the barracks. The psychological torment was relentless. Even when executions were not carried out openly, their shadow hovered over every aspect of camp life. The nightly knock on the door of the barracks became a ritual of terror. NKVD officers would arrive, call out names from their lists, and lead prisoners away into the darkness. Everyone knew what it meant. The silence in the barracks as the chosen ones walked out was described by survivors as unbearable. Men and women holding their breath, waiting for the next name, praying it would not be theirs. Some prisoners kissed their comrades goodbye, others avoided eye contact, unable to face the inevitability of death. Those left behind lay awake, staring into the dark, listening for the faint crack of gunshots echoing from beyond the camp's edge. The randomness of it all intensified the horror. Executions were not always tied to clear offenses. Sometimes a quota from Moscow demanded a certain number of counter-revolutionaries be eliminated, and names were selected at random to meet the target. One man might be spared while his bunkmate was executed, not because of guilt but because his name happened to fill a line on a form. This randomness destroyed any sense of justice or logic, leaving only chaos. Survival became a matter of chance, and that knowledge hollowed out the humanity of those still alive. Some executions were carried out with deliberate cruelty meant to humiliate. Prisoners accused of espionage or sabotage were paraded in front of others, branded with insults, and beaten before being killed. There are accounts of prisoners being forced to confess crimes they never committed in front of the entire camp, their voices breaking under duress, before being executed moments later. This combination of psychological and physical destruction ensured that the executed died not only as victims but as broken examples for others to fear. For the guards, executions became tools of entertainment and domination. Survivor testimonies describe officers mocking prisoners before killing them, forcing them to sing songs or recite slogans in praise of Stalin while standing over their own graves. In some cases, guards staged fake executions, firing blanks or releasing prisoners after hours of terror, only to execute them later. This sadistic game amplified the despair, blurring the line between life and death until prisoners no longer knew whether they were living or merely awaiting the inevitable. Executions in the gulags were not about eliminating threats, they were about maintaining total control. They created an atmosphere where every prisoner knew they were expendable, where life hung on the whim of a guard or the stroke of a pen. They destroyed solidarity, as fear turned comrades into silent witnesses who dared not resist. And they left scars that stretched far beyond the camps. Families outside often never knew the truth, receiving vague notices of death attributed to illness or accident. The silence was part of the cruelty, erasing even the dignity of remembrance. What makes these executions so difficult to stomach today is their coldness. They were not acts of passion or chaos, but routine procedures embedded in daily life. In Stalin's gulags, death was not the exception, but part of the system, and the brutality of those executions, by bullet, by freezing, by starvation, by spectacle, ensured that the camps were not only prisons but cemeteries in slow motion. The gulags were never just prisons. They were slaughterhouses hidden in plain sight. Yet for decades, the scale of executions inside them remained buried, both literally and politically. Stalin's regime was skilled at erasing evidence, and even after his death in 1953, the truth of what happened in those camps was slow to emerge. It took decades of excavation, declassification, and survivor testimony for the world to begin piecing together the sheer brutality of gulag executions. What was uncovered was worse than even many historians had feared: mass graves, forests filled with bones, and documents revealing that executions had been carried out not sporadically, but systematically. The physical evidence began surfacing in the late Soviet period and expanded after the USSR collapsed. Across Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, entire forests were found to conceal mass graves. One of the most infamous was in Budovo, just outside Moscow. This former firing range became a killing ground where between 1937 and 1938 alone, more than 20,000 people were executed. Excavations revealed long trenches filled with human remains, layer upon layer of skeletons, many still showing bullet holes in their skulls. Lists from the NKVD matched the numbers almost perfectly, proving that this was no accident of war but deliberate, coldly organized extermination. Sites like Budovo were not isolated. In Sandermok, a remote forest in Karelia, researchers discovered a burial ground containing the remains of over 7,000 people, many of them political prisoners from gulags in the region. Their executions had been carried out in batches, bodies dumped into pits and covered hastily. For decades, locals had whispered about the killings, but only in the 1990s did the truth come to light. The silence of the Soviet state had hidden not only the graves but the memory of those buried within them. Families never learned what happened to their loved ones. Death certificates often listed false causes such as heart failure or pneumonia. In reality, a bullet to the skull ended their lives. In Siberia, where gulags dotted the landscape like scars, similar graves have been unearthed. Camps such as Vorkuta, Norilsk, and Kolyma, places synonymous with suffering, yielded evidence of mass executions carried out far from public view. In Kolyma, survivors spoke of prisoners being taken out into the taiga and never returning. Decades later, bones were found in shallow pits, confirming their stories. These graves revealed not just the deaths but the anonymity forced upon them. No markers, no names, just silent fields where the state had erased the humanity of its victims. Documents declassified after Stalin's death further confirmed the horror. NKVD files revealed quotas for executions, with regional officers ordered to eliminate a set number of counter-revolutionaries. These quotas were often filled arbitrarily, with lists compiled to meet numbers rather than based on real crimes. The records also showed the chilling bureaucracy behind the killings, the number of bullets issued, the officers responsible, the precise dates of execution. The killings were not random, they were systematic, logged like shipments of goods in and out of warehouses. Death had become an administrative function of Stalin's regime. The truth was not easy for Soviet society to accept. Even after Stalin's death, the government sought to downplay the atrocities. Nikita Khrushchev's sacred speech in 1956 denounced some of Stalin's crimes, but it was vague on details, focusing on political purges rather than the full scope of Gulag executions. For decades afterward, access to archives remained restricted, and survivors who spoke out risked harassment. Only with Glasnost in the 1980s and the fall of the USSR in 1991 did the silence begin to break. Families finally learned that their loved ones had not died of illness, but had been executed and dumped into mass graves. For historians and archaeologists, the uncovering of these graves was both vindication and horror. Survivor accounts, long dismissed as exaggerations, were confirmed in bone and earth. The bullet holes, the shallow pits, the sheer numbers, all told a story too brutal to deny. But with confirmation came a heavy burden, understanding just how widespread and normalized executions had become in Stalin's gulags. What makes the discoveries so disturbing is the way they reveal a calculated effort to erase the victims. The state not only killed but also made sure the dead would vanish from history. No memorials were allowed, and no public mourning was permitted. Families were told lies, often decades after the fact. This deliberate erasure turned executions into a double death, the physical end of the victim and the destruction of their memory. It is this silence that survivors found hardest to bear, knowing that millions were buried in unmarked graves, their stories lost unless someone fought to bring them back. Today, memorials stand at sites like Budovo and Sandermok, where names are read aloud to restore dignity to the forgotten. But the full scale of Gulag executions is still not completely known. Some graves remain undiscovered, hidden in forests or beneath industrial complexes built over them. Others may never be found.